Hello, and welcome to another episode of Never Go Against the Family. We're coming to you live from the University of Northern Iowa Family Business Center in Cedar Falls, Iowa. We follow family businesses and topics that help your family business sustain itself. In this episode, you're getting double Dans. Our director, Dan Beenken, interviews Dann Van Der Vliet, who works at the Smith Family Business Initiative at Cornell in Ithaca, New York. This year, they put out a survey that asked next-generation leaders about their experiences in the family business. Stay tuned to hear what the survey revealed.
What I would talk about with the Next Gen survey is that, this was a first attempt. It's an outgrowth of what we do with the owner survey with Family Enterprise USA.
Yep.
It's a very targeted audience, meaning students who are currently in family business or entrepreneurship classes.
So they're just students.
Just students, current students.
Okay.
So I think,
They
people
have to be from a family-owned, multi-generational, or a family-owned.
Well, they're in a family business class.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Okay.
So this is just me guesstimating. I would say, if we have 500 students in family business classes across the USA, I would say probably 60% of those are probably from family business, and it might be a little bit higher.
Okay.
But, when I look at my class, I do get a mix. I get students from, especially like in the MBA, who are more advisor, consultant, investment banker type people.
Yep.
I get some people more from the labor side, like human resources or law, and they're looking at family business really as a part of the likely work in a family business.
Yep.
With the family business. And so, the goal here is that we will continue to grow this and offer it annually, and actually probably have to get working on this year's survey because we really missed the fall semester last year. So really this was probably about half of who we could have captured.
So then you partner up with schools and professors and faculty around the country that are teaching this kind of a class, and you ask them to distribute it to their students?
That's correct. So, using the Alliance as our kind of starting point.
Okay.
Probably identified about 10 or 12 centers, or at least schools that have active family business classes that we have good relationships with the faculty member. So I would like to see that grow. So I'm continually looking for faculty and or people who are teaching family business.
Yeah.
And the goal is that it's a more of a captive audience than just trying to put a survey out into the ether. Approximately, I think we had 90 something responses overall, which is low. So I think on one hand, the key is that this is a starting point, and it has yielded some interesting data. It is not completely conclusive, but it aligns with what I typically hear from students either in my class or other students that I work with. So I think it's a good proxy for what some of these students are thinking of at this stage. If the college years are really where they're supposed to kind of help figure out what their choices are going to be for the rest of their lives or their career, then they're concerned. They're looking forward to the next 5 years and saying, well, I do want to join the family business, but there's definitely some challenges to that.
Okay.
And I think it should sort of help us to understand, okay, well, how should we then craft some of our educational choices to better inform students at this age?
Oh yeah, and our programming for their parents and things like that too. Yeah. I
think that's an important distinction that, this is not next gen, and because I actually think for next year, we're going to change the name to Rising Gen. But it's not for a lot of us in family business. We talk about next gen as probably the people who are already working in their family business.
mean, it's like everything else, it's a term that starts to become kind of genericized with lots of different who fits next gen. You know, sometimes people are thinking about their kids at home in fifth grade or something, and so I get what you're saying though. Okay, I didn't realize it was that focused on that kind of segment of
Mhm.
age. So what I wanted to talk about then, you know, beyond that, kind of getting a sense of where it came from is, um, you know, you mentioned family communication was like the first takeaway or the top concern of students, which doesn't, you know, I would assume surprises no one in the family business space, right? It's confirming, of course, but you know, do you have any takeaways as to why, you know, you think that is, where they're coming from when they mention family communication?
I mean, I believe it's two-way.
Yeah.
I think first there's a generational divide in how let's just call it the senior generation communicates versus the younger generation.
Okay.
I think for many in the senior generation, they don't want to scare the kids away. So they may be deliberately
Okay.
holding back some level of communication.
Okay.
And perhaps the younger generation is taking that as a signal of like, you know, they're not sharing anything with me. Um, I think for many families, you know, it there has to be sort of a forum where this communication can take place, and that's a big step to have a family meeting or a family office that often these communications can take place in. Um, and also, you know, I
And that's
think
probably sorely lacking for a lot of families, right?
yeah, yeah. So, I mean, family communication is such a big term. So
Yeah.
it's even though this was rated as one of the top concerns, I think this would be an area where you could dig a little bit further into, like, so what's lacking? You know,
Yeah.
what would you hope to hear from your mom or dad or whomever? Um, and have you share that with them? Because often, you know, I work with students and they'll say something like, "Yeah, well, you know, mom and dad expect me to come back to the business." I'm like, "Well, how do you know that?" "Well, they just do." I'm like, "Well, have you had that conversation?" "No." You know, so it's like, you know, so again, that kind of gets to that generational difference of, I, you know, again, being somewhat stereotypical, but I think the younger generation, you know, expects this information like they can just pick up, you know, Instagram and find it out from, or TikTok,
Yeah.
where, you know, often there's a lot more nuance to the communication of, you know, what's the form for sharing this communication? How are you asking it? You know, what are some of the expectations that are put upon that communication?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, there's a lot more nuance to it, and they're maybe getting more and more used to 3 to 5 second type of responses and answers and images and all that. And the
Yeah.
parents want to have a lot of other factors involved with those decisions and discussions than just simply, we'd like you to come back. And uh but when you're 21, 22, 18, 19, whatever, you're in a different frame of mind. I That's awesome that you're mentioning that. Okay. What other parts of that? Like, so you said you might dig into that more.
Yeah, so you know, I think coupled with that is sort of this kind of, and this is what every kid deals with. I mean, you and I probably deal with this, you know, like, am I qualified to do what I do? Right? You know,
Yep.
this
Yep.
either, you know, call it imposter syndrome or call it, you know, like, how will I know when I'm ready? Well, like, how do you know when you're ready to be a parent? Like, you know, you never take a test, you know, you just become a parent one day.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so I think for many at this age, you know, this is an age of reflection. It's an age of self-doubt. Um, and, you know, as they look forward, like, is this what I really want to do? And what I see, especially for this age is, and especially in our culture, in our US, North American culture, which is very individualistic, it's very self-centered. And I'm not saying that in a negative way, but, you know, we are taught that we are important. We make our own choices, and, we kind of have to live with our decisions. That's not the way it works in India. That's not the way it works in China, or Latin America. But here in North America, there's very much a drive to create something, to be yourself. And so
Yep.
this manifest in college with, I want to go work on Wall Street. I want to go work for, one of the big, Amazon or Apple or whomever, kind of get my
Yep.
passport stamped, if you will.
Yep.
But what I see is many of those students doing that, and then suddenly they hit 30, and their sort of inner clock changes, and they start thinking about family. They start thinking about where they want to live. They've spent times in the city. They've traveled around, and suddenly, like where they grew up and the business they grew up with, which was not very sexy when they were 18, looks a lot different. And we see them start to come back and like, wow, I could be a president of this business, by the time I'm 35. I could own this business by the time I'm 45. So I think that's baked into that, am I qualified? Because, they see what mom and dad have gone through. They also feel the weight of legacy. Legacy is the number one word that they all came to when asked, what's the first word you think of when you hear the term family business? Legacy has a lot baked into it, right? Legacy for a senior generation is something they're proud of. It's something they want to give to their children. But if you're an 18-year-old kid, like, you look at that legacy as a burden. You look at legacy as like, man, like, um, there's a lot of people counting on me, and I'm not
Yep.
sure I'm ready for this.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So, and I'm always careful with this word legacy because we throw it around in family business all the time. But it's one of those words that we really have to unpack, because it means a lot of different things to different people. And so that's why I always start off like a talk with, I use this question, what's the first word that comes to your mind when you hear the term family business? And undoubtedly legacy comes up, but then there's all these other words that have all these mixed meanings, like small, conflict, nepotism, communication, loyalty, like all of these words, depending on who's saying them, can have vastly different differences. So all of that sort of gets mixed up into this family business stew. And so it really depends on sort of how you come to family business that is really important.
So that whole, am I qualified to join, take over?
And then, I think that question, and I've started using this in the last couple of years, and it's been very effective, is, if you had the courage to ask your parents any question, what would it be? And
Yes. Okay.
responses that, come out of that are, some really meaningful and necessary questions. But then the follow-up to that is, okay, so why don't you ask that question? What's keeping you from asking that question? That's something we couldn't do in this survey. Maybe we'll do it in year 2. But in a classroom, then you can really start to unpack like, well, we don't talk about money. I don't want my parents to think, I'm wondering what's going to happen when they die. There's a lot of great tools that can elicit some of this conversation. I use
Yeah.
legacy cards a lot as well, and those
Yeah.
are just picture cards, right?
Yeah. We use the values cards too.
Yeah,
And
but
yep.
it gets people talking, beyond like just saying, hey, Dan, what are your values? Like, well, it's easier sometimes to pick up a picture and say, here's a person on a mountaintop. I really value exercise. I really value nature. I really value
Sure.
fitness, whatever.
How many people do you need in the room from that family to make that a worthwhile conversation where you're using these, anonymous question starters, conversation starters, and collecting data through these 3 generations? You must have like 7 or 8 people in the room, right?
So I think that's two-sided. I would say on first, you only need 2, right? Because 2 is where communication starts. But
Okay. Okay.
what's more important is who's not in the room. So that's why I often use like a family diagram as a way of maybe focusing on like, okay, well, you've got a lot of information about all these people, but like this corner of your family diagram is pretty empty. Why is that? Well, they never come to family meetings. Have you ever talked to them?
Yeah.
What's going on there? And so I'll use this in class as sort of an exercise, and it gives, you give students license to go ask the question. Like, hey, Dan, I know like, your dad and my dad don't talk anymore, but I have to do this assignment for class. So tell me about your story.
Yeah.
And it, that's an effective way to sort of open a line of communication. And I've told all my students, like, you can use that excuse even if you're not in my class.
Sure.
Use that as sort of,
Blame me. Yeah.
exactly. Hey, I got this professor at Cornell. He really wants me to ask you this. And it's just it's a soft way of sort of like, saying, okay, can we have this talk? Because this is important.
How about we go back to a couple more of these open-ended responses that you got? I think they're pretty cool. And just get your perspective on them as far as the answers that they are.
Mhm.
When I read here, what would it take to trust me? So that's the next gen saying, what would it take to trust me? What do I have to show? Right. So what are your thoughts when you see that one?
I, I would say, this is tied to that. Am I qualified? That, was one of the big concerns,
Yep.
top of mind issues. And, I think this trust issue comes like, how does the family communicate? How does the family operate? And, trust it's something that I think within families is inherent, right? It's our basis for trust. I mean, if we can't trust our
Yeah.
siblings, if we can't trust our parents,
That's
then we've got a tough battle. So I think there's sort of an inherent level of trust, but then there's also that sort of implicit level of what does trust really look like? Like how much do you trust me? Do you
Sure.
trust me to take your $100,000 car out for a drive? Do you trust me to run, to run this part of the company, or do you trust me to be, manage this division?
Yep.
And I think that level of trust gets built over time because I trust you because we're brothers, but that's a family trust. Then there's sort of this operational trust of, are you capable? Can you do the job?
My guest has been Daniel Van Der Vliet. He is the John and Diane Smith Executive Director of Family Business at Cornell University. The Cornell University, the one in New York, not the one in Iowa.
They're
And
related though,
they are related. They are very much related. And also related is that uh, the great founders of your program, John and Diane Smith, of course, are Iowans as well. They live just their business is based about an hour from here, and incredibly large trucking logistics technology firm in the Cedar Rapids area, CRST. So, Dan, I love that you've been able to share some highlights from the survey. I think it's getting at deeper rationale and thought than other things do at times. Let's cover one more. Is the family business worth the conflict that it brings? So that's another one of these open-ended responses you got in there. I think that's also interesting. Is the juice worth the squeeze? Is the comment there? So what thoughts do you have when you hear that one from a next gen?
Yeah, I go back to, what happened growing up. Think about the dinner table, as the convening of most families, at least for, some portion of their existence.
Yep.
And, in the family business, you sit down at the dinner table, and if matters of business are carried over to the dinner table, if times are hard, then that probably doesn't make for great dinner conversation. Or, think in a situation where, mom and dad sit down and, they had a bad day at work, but because it's family business, it's not just a bad day at work, it's a bad day with your brother, your sister, your mom, your dad.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the challenge there is then, that's what the kids learn. Okay. And the kids learn the story. So
Yeah.
in the case of family business, if my dad's the president CEO, the story I get is going to be maybe much different than, you, my cousin, because your dad was, worked for my dad,
Sure.
right?
Absolutely.
Dad came home and he couldn't stand working for his older brother,
Right.
right? So,
Yeah.
So this is the story of family business that gets passed down. And so if that conflict exists there, and it's ever present, right? At least for you and me, Dan, we work in a university and we can go home and we can put a lot of that stuff behind us.
Oh, yeah.
But if we were brothers and we worked in the same family business and then we show up at whatever holiday or whatever family function, it's the same communication, right? And there's sometimes that distance, that rift between us.
Yep.
So if that's what your lived experience is, why? Why is there a reticence to sell? The business is seemingly worth a lot of money. Wouldn't that be better if we could get rid of the conflict by selling,
Yep.
or at least change the course somehow? And that's a big question that comes up, and I think it really, for this generation, these are students in that 18 to 25 year range. If that's their lived experience, why do you fight with your brother so much? Why do you and your dad don't talk? And why doesn't, Aunt Mary Jane show up to, family events? Why, if she's an owner of the business, does she have no voice here? So I think that's very telling, but that's a hard question to ask too, right?
Oh, yeah, which is why it was written here in the anonymous section of your survey, right? Because it is a very hard question to ask. That's what I was just thinking about as you were talking about it was, at the dinner table or otherwise, how would you, start to have that conversation with your parents, questioning their relationship with elderly, more senior position people in the family than you are. That's real tough stuff to ask. I would think you're kind of, in a sense, calling them out, potentially, or that might be the fear of asking that question, is that the parents will take it that way, and so consequently some of those questions they never get asked. I think that's really insightful. With what you've gotten here from takeaways from the survey, and again, this was the inaugural survey of your next gen survey, in conjunction with Family Enterprise USA and academic faculty around the country, it sounds like, maybe around the globe. What do you want to do with the next one? What do you want to hear in the next one that will build upon this?
Yeah. So again, this was a first time study. We got about 100 respondents, and we really targeted schools in North America. I do think there's an opportunity to maybe make this more global, but that would be something we could grow into.
Yep.
For this coming year, we want to really be able to survey both fall and spring semester students, because I think we missed some of those last year by starting in the spring. And, a few things. One, if we repeat this every year, then you get a little bit of that great baseline data, right? So Family Enterprise USA has done an owner survey for the last almost 15 years. And it's pretty consistent from year to year, but you do see trends of our businesses, optimistic. Is our taxes too high?
Yeah.
Taxes are always too high, but sometimes more high than others.
Yep.
And I think it would be important in this to see what is changing and what's staying the same. I would suspect some of these questions might stay the same. And I think that's really important data for those that are teaching these classes to address, well, how do we get over some of these family communication issues? How do we sort of teach good communication practices within the family and the business? What are sort of the levers of trust that are important, and how might we encourage our students to pull on some of those levers? And I think a lot of this ultimately for the student and for the family business, I would argue, come down to having good forms of communication. And these are the things we teach in our class, right? We teach the 3 circles, that within each of those 3 circles, family, business, and ownership, there's governance, and governance is how we communicate effectively. And I often use the term big G governance and little g governance. Little g governance are the talks that you have. It's the sitting down with mom or dad sitting down with siblings and having the informal conversations. And that's where often the trust begins. That's how you start to build up those relationships and that repertoire of, okay, these are topics that we can talk about openly.
Yeah, you
And then,
can't have big G without little G.
that's
Yeah.
right. And so big G is the formal governance. That's like when you get into the family constitutions and board of directors. And again, big G governance exists in all three of those circles. That's in the ownership circle, in the management circle, and in the family circle. But for families, I think big G governance is a challenge because in all of our families, there are rules that are unwritten. I was in a family of 6, and at the dinner table, I knew where I sat, and I sat in that seat every single time. That was never written down, but I knew where I sat. And if I sat in, my brother Scott's seat across the table, like I would hear about it. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
It's
big
probably
G,
the same with if you were ever all in the car together.
right?
Yeah.
Right. So like big G governance would actually have a chart and say, okay, this is where you sit. This is your role around the table. But families are very uncomfortable doing that. So I think but that's often a really critical part of this communication is, it's in that family circle where you have the talks about, okay, what does it mean to work in this business? Will we ever sell this business? What are we willing to tolerate from a conflict standpoint? How do we be inclusive of those that are not either working in the business or who have differing viewpoints from us?
Yeah.
And so that's uncomfortable for a lot of families. But research has shown those families that do tackle that tend to survive longer and have healthier businesses.
Yeah, I'm glad we can wrap up there. I'm glad that you mentioned that because that's where I was going to bring it back to end today's discussion was, everything kind of comes back to the top concern that your survey identified, which was this issue of family communication. And so if you were to give one suggestion to our listeners who are predominantly our family businesses, our members and clients of our center, what would you give them as a 2 or 3, sentence advice point for family communication?
Yeah, I often tell my students or encourage my students, I should say, invite your mom and or your dad out to coffee or lunch, and just start with some of these questions. Hey, I've been thinking about this a lot. Or I'm curious about your relationship with your whoever. Because that's the little G governance that I think is important. And the setting matters. Don't do this at the business in the office. Make this a family conversation and not a business conversation. And as I shared earlier, if you have to invoke the name of your professor, hey, I need to do this for an assignment. And he or she wants me to ask this question, do that. And if it gives you license to maybe be a little more bold and ask a question that you might not ask yourself, then that's okay. And respect what the answer might be, because maybe they're not ready to talk about it. None of us like thinking about our own mortality. We don't want to. You might not want to start with the question, "Hey, what happens when you die?" Right?
Sure.
That's something
to
you
warm up to that,
and maybe ask it in a better way. But you can lead up to that. How did you get into this business, Dad? Or what would it take for you to leave? And I think those are the questions that are curious questions. Those are the questions that can begin to sort of expose what your interests are, as well as reveal maybe a side of your somebody else that you're not aware of. They might have had other plans too. Maybe they don't. They came back to the business and they had plans to be a doctor or a nurse or to travel more, but they had to come back because their mom or dad was sick, or somebody left the business and they're like, hey, son, I need you to come work for us now. 30 years later, you're still there. And I've seen that I've seen that play out numerous times. And so I think it's sort of finding that common space, and not always sort of pitting it as a, me against you, or why do you always do it like this type, question.
I wrote down that, how did you get into the business? Because I think that's a great question. I mean, it's leading a little bit, I think, for the other person. If I'm the senior and you're the junior and you ask me that, I'm like, I can play through my mind where that might be going. That might be going to, okay, maybe junior's starting to ask about how he gets into the business, which is great, which is good. And he's not asking it in that way. He wants to understand me better. He wants to understand my background and how it related to the business, and therefore how I might make thoughts and decisions or have ideas about how junior should then enter the business and that kind of thing. So I think that's a pretty insightful question that they can like start from. And it's also Switzerland, it doesn't have any ticking time bombs associated with it, or barbs or anything like that are going to come out. So that's great. Dan, you're always a wealth of knowledge. I'm fairly somewhat new in this arena, and I've always been able to glean a lot from you, and how you run your center there at Cornell and at Vermont previously. Greatly appreciate your time. Thanks for being on with us as a guest today. Again, our guest has been Daniel Van Der Vliet. He's the John and Diane Smith Executive Director of Family Business at Cornell in Ithaca, and not the one in Cedar Rapids, just so we clarify that. And Dan, thank you so much.
All right, Daniel, my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Never Go Against the Family, a podcast produced by the University of Northern Iowa Family Business Center. You can find more information about the center, membership, and upcoming events at unifamilybusinesscenter.com. As Vito Corleone advises, never go against the family.